Okay, I'm Bob Pacelli, and I'm from Pacific Grove, California. And today we're going to talk about the Monarchs. And I guess my relationship with the Monarchs is twofold. Number one, as a local news cameraman for the last 30 or so years, I was in the sanctuary every season to film the Monarchs, which gave me sort of an institutional knowledge of where the Monarchs were in relationship to the sunlight and the camera angles. And I'm kind of the go-to guy when crews come from all over the world. They'll phone the film commission or email them and ask them, where are the Monarchs? And they'll usually contact me because I filmed them for Spanish TV, I've filmed them for English TV, I filmed them for Oprah Winfrey. So that's part of my relationship with the Monarchs. My other part of it is that 20-odd years ago, when I first moved to Pacific Grove with my wife, we were involved on a very minor level in helping the people who put the sanctuary together. It was actually the drive of one woman, Rhoda Caro, who's since passed away, our famed butterfly lady, who saw the potential of this piece of land that had a bunch of dilapidated buildings on it and a whole bunch of monarchs. And she went ahead and passed the bond, got all the signatures, got the city together, and went through a whole myriad of programs and a whole bunch of things, from the zoning to the financing through the bond issue to the right-of-way to the neighbors to all the things that go into making up a sanctuary, which is very rarely done. And the Pacific Grove Sanctuary is especially important because it's one of the only urban sanctuaries in America. It's right in the middle of a neighborhood. Monarchs are migrating butterflies, so if they don't have one part of the migration comes to Pacific Grove, if that part is eliminated, it sort of affects the whole situation. Monarchs that come here are fourth generation. It takes 4 generations of the life and death cycle for the monarchs to return to Pacific Grove. When the monarchs come here in October, they spend the overwintering. They all cluster together and try to remain warm through the winter. And as the spring comes, they mate, and then after the mating, the males pass away. But it's kind of a happy ritual, and the females fly on to Fresno to lay their eggs on milkweed. And then the females die, and that generation's born, and it flies to, depending on who you ask, to Oregon. And the sequence completes itself again, and then once in Washington until they return on the 4th generation from Canada. So this incredible thing happens where, you know, this is like the great-great-grandchild of the monarch that you'll see this winter in Pacific Grove will return the previous fall. And how that happens and why it happens and why they specifically come to Pacific Grove is, you know, it's been written about. In fact, some of the first writings go back to 1914. If anybody's into it, there's a book about Pacific Grove. It's called The Monarchs of Pacific Grove, 1914. And they claim in the book that the monarchs had been there at least 50 years earlier. So, you know, but there's a lot of folk tales and a lot of speculation on why the monarchs come or why they stay. But what we can tell is that we've created a microclimate. And in that microclimate, there's moisture, there's sunlight, there's the right amount of temperature, and there's the right amount of movement without disturbing to the point that they're thrown off the branches, but they can go ahead and cluster on in the great numbers that keep them warm through the winter. The location has changed over the years. Originally it was at Washington Park in Pacific Grove, and then it moved over to where it currently is up on Ridge Road about 30 or 40 years ago, but it's really hard to tell. They reside in eucalyptus. Eucalyptus are non-native trees, so why did the eucalyptus get there, and why are they sitting in the eucalyptus as opposed to the pines, which you see and read about from the 1914s? It's a mystery, but the pines are disappearing, and they might have adapted to the eucalyptus. Who knows? But Pacific Grove is special. Some people think it's magnetism. Some people think it's magnetic resonance off the ground in the way the monarchs can feel the warmth in terms of thermals. And the fact that our monarchs come here in 1s or 2s make it really hard to tell, because they'll fly 10, 20,000 feet up and then drop down to the grove. And there's been a lot of reports from airline pilots who see the monarchs fluttering outside their cockpits at 10 to 15,000 feet up. And this is pretty regular stuff. That's one of the few facts we do know. Some of the things I say are speculation, and some of them are facts, and it depends which PhD you're reading. But because they don't come in big numbers, you know, all of a sudden you'll see one or two flying around, and then bingo. The next morning there'll be 1,000 of them. And a lot of the local folklore is that they'll call them scouts. And once again, the scientist will say, no, it couldn't be a scout, because a scout would have to return to its mass and give you the information to the troops. But in fact, I figure, hey, you know, if they can figure out how to get here after 4 generations, who's to say a scout can't telepathically send it back to a Monarchs? And the Monarchs are here because it's a special place, and the special place had to be gently protected. Because in microclimate, you don't know what forces of nature, what forces work on nature, where the temperature's coming from. Is it a group of trees in the corner that's a half acre away? Is it the canopy over the top from the pine trees that's been there for hundreds of years, or is it the eucalyptus? So all these things form together to make canopies and things that make basically monarch cul-de-sacs. Which brings us to what happened in 2009. In 2009, unfortunately, through a series of changes in institutional memory in the city of Pacific Grove, somebody walked in there and said, you know, we really got to cut down these eucalyptus. A lot of it was driven on fear and ignorance and good intentions. So after 20 years of having this sanctuary where if anybody even touched it, you know, people were real aware of its existence, and cutting trees or doing anything up there was a big no-no, to almost radical extents where we had trees, limbs would fall down over fences and we'd let them sit there because we knew in the fall, even though they had brown leaves on them, the monarchs would come and sit on them. So the whole issue was what was best for the monarchs. Started to develop to, well, what's best for docents, or what's best for this, what's healthy and safety in line for a public park. Well, it isn't a public park, it's a sanctuary, and it's a habitat. And there's very few of them left in the world, and a lot of the numbers are going down and going up depending who you ask. And it's like Pacific Grove's Walden Pond. We have this incredible gift. All these years I'd photographed the monarchs. Over a 20-year span, more or less. Every year I'd go up and film the monarchs for the news. So I even had little rocks in places where I used to put my tripods. So I pulled out all the videotapes that I had shot all those years, and I created stills. And then we took stills of what was going on now, and we put them up in newspapers and started forming ads going, look, this is what it looked like, and this is what it is now. And it was empty and bare. So there's all these issues about putting eucalyptus back, about is it ever been cut before, is it really matter, is it global warming that's causing? But we went from 20,000 monarchs a year before to about 700, and that went down to about 300. Now these things were counted by Cal Poly, who does our counting, right? So, you got to figure out where was fact and where was fiction. So here's our numbers, here's the photos. And I came upon this shopping center in Marina. Then they had these huge trees sitting there in pots. And I thought, well, if we can take those trees and move them into Pacific Grove, we got a shot at this. And the reason being is, after looking at all these videos, I can't replace you can't replace the limbs that were cut. And their movement was so magnificent, and they all moved in unison, and everything hung on to the monarchs hung on, and they don't climb up. But what we could do is create a windbreak so that the branches that were still there could then go ahead and support the monarchs again. And my initial intention was not to rebuild the sanctuary, was to get some big old trees there, because there were areas that I had filmed that were still intact that they didn't get to, but the monarchs couldn't hang on because there was no windbreak from the rest of the branches that had been cut. And at one point I put a posting on the Monarch newsletter, the Western Monarch newsletter, and there's a tremendous amount of interest and understanding of what happens in Pacific Grove with the monarchs. One of the best citizen scientists, in the middle of an argument, said, well, you know, the only thing that probably will work is this plan that Bob Pacelli is worth a try. So from that, I spun it into a whole project because there was a limited amount of time to do it. This happened in like July or the early August, and you can only work in the sanctuary till October 1st. So at the end of July, basically, I took out a bunch of ads in the paper with the photographs of before and after, and I asked people to make donations. And I didn't have a 401 or 501c3. I just said, hey, look. And I didn't have permission. But I was going to all the meetings. And in the middle of this thing, I'm going to these meetings, and I realized that up at the sanctuary, in one of the spots that was most important, because the fences had been knocked down over the years, that part of the property in the middle of the sanctuary didn't belong to the city, it belonged to a private resident. So I went and asked that private resident if I could put a tree on her property. And she said yes. So I went up and bought an oak, and we put this huge oak in a box right in the middle of the sanctuary that was actually on this private property. And it kind of showed people what could happen. But, you know, we were writing stories in the local paper, and somebody from the LA Times came down. But he didn't come down to see he was actually a Monarch guy. There's a whole bunch of people. This guy is a big writer for the LA Times, came through and stopped and said, looked at the sanctuary and immediately knew what happened with the cutting, and went around and picked up the local papers. And then he contacted me, and we did a story in the LA Times about it that I think got a lot of people's attention. Went out and collected $6,000–7,000, and then we found the problem was that the eucalyptus don't exist anymore in nurseries because they're a non-native species. People hate eucalyptus. And one of the reasons of putting them in boxes instead of putting them in the ground was it mitigated all those answers of what are you going to put, why. You know, look, we just put them in a box now and stick them there and see what happens. You know what I mean? So so in the end, we got some off of Craigslist. Got farmed from Fort Bragg, and they brought them down. And I thought, well, if this guy can farm them, let me find another place to farm them. And I asked a nursery guy in Gilroy, and I went up to Big Sur, and you got to be careful going around Big Sur, looking at property to try to farm trees. But in the end, the nursery guy found me somebody in Gilroy who had grown 7 acres of eucalyptus because his grandfather owned a B&B in Carmel. And they used the little logs to burn in the fires, you know, at night because they smelled good. So we farmed about 20 of them or 30 of them and brought them in there. So all these meetings and all these pendejos who were like, actually helped this happen, were all on these committees, right? So there's only one more council meeting before the end of August so that we can go ahead and do this work. You know, there's a time frame going, right? So I got this money. I figured out how to get the trees. How the hell are we going to do this, right? I had to go to Florida. I'm going to shoot, right? So I said to all the people, I says, look, either you're going to do it or it's not going to happen. So they showed up at the city council meeting, and they all spoke, and the mayor got up and apologized for the damage that was done. And they gave me the go-ahead to do what they called Operation Pacelli at that point. And that year, we went from 700 to 7,000. But when we get 20,000, then it's healthy again. We're going to try to do it again this year.